Two men started the same job on the same Monday morning. Same salary, same city, same coffee from the same cart on the corner of 5th and Main. 15 years later, one of them retired early. The other is still working, not because he wants to, but because he has to. Same income, same years, completely different lives. And here is what makes this story strange. The one who retired wasn't the one who earned more. Hi, I'm Buck, and today we're going to rethink how money really works. If you've ever gotten a raise and somehow ended up with less room to breathe, you're exactly where this conversation is meant to find you. Let's start with something most of us have felt but never quite named. You're making more money than you've ever made in your life. And yet, every month, something is tight. Not dramatically tight, just tight. There's a low-level hum of financial anxiety that shouldn't be there given what you're earning. You look at your income and then you look at your account, and the math doesn't add up the way it should. You tell yourself the next raise will fix it. And somewhere in the back of your mind, you remember telling yourself that the last time too. That feeling has a name, and understanding it is worth more than any raise you'll ever get. Marcus and Daniel. That's who we're talking about today. Two real archetypes, drawn from patterns I've watched play out over and over again in conversations with people who are honest enough to talk about the gap between what they earn and what they feel. Marcus was the one everyone expected to win. He was sharp, driven, and perpetually promoted. By 34, he was clearing $140,000 a year. He had the apartment to match, high floor, city view, doorman who knew his name. He had the car, not flashy, but expensive. The kind that says, "I've arrived," without quite announcing it. He had the vacations, photographed beautifully. 2 or 3 a year. He was, by every visible measure, exactly what success was supposed to look like. His LinkedIn was a highlight reel that made former classmates quietly question their own progress. Daniel was quieter about it. He made less, for longer. He drove a car he'd bought used and held on to well past the point where his colleagues found it endearing. He lived in a neighborhood that wasn't interesting enough to post about. He said no to things other people said yes to almost automatically. The weekend trips, the group dinners at places with no prices on the menu, the round of drinks that quietly signaled belonging. He maxed out his retirement contributions when Marcus was still deciding which restaurant to take clients to, and whether to expense the second bottle of wine. Here is what I want you to hold in your mind, because this is the thing that usually gets lost in this conversation. Marcus didn't make bad decisions. He made completely reasonable ones. Each upgrade, each expense, felt like the natural next step for someone at his level. That's the part nobody tells you about lifestyle inflation. It doesn't feel like inflation. It feels like progress. It feels like finally letting yourself live the life the work was supposed to earn. There's a concept in behavioral economics called hedonic adaptation. The idea is simple, and it should unsettle you a little. Whatever you have right now, the apartment, the car, the salary, your brain will adapt to it, not slowly, quickly. Within months, sometimes weeks, whatever felt like an upgrade becomes the new floor, the new baseline, the thing you'd feel anxious to lose rather than grateful to have. The new car becomes transportation. The nicer apartment becomes just where you sleep. The elevated restaurant becomes just dinner. The extraordinary, without any effort on your part, becomes ordinary. This is not a character flaw. It is neuroscience. The human brain is not designed to feel lasting satisfaction from what it already has. It's designed to pursue the next thing. That design served us extraordinarily well for 100,000 years of survival. It serves us poorly in a world built specifically to exploit it. The marketing industry understands hedonic adaptation better than most financial advisors do. Every premium tier, every upgrade path, every loyalty level exists because the people who design them know exactly how quickly you'll stop noticing the one below it. The whole engine runs on the reliable predictability of human dissatisfaction. Your discomfort is the product, which means that if your spending grows in lockstep with your earnings, you will always feel like you're making exactly not enough. Not because something is wrong with you, because something is working exactly as designed. Marcus felt this. He just didn't have a name for it. He kept assuming the next level would be the one that finally stuck, the one that would feel like a rival instead of just another floor to stand on. Every raise unlocked a new expense, not frivolously, rationally. He earned more, so he could afford more, so he spent more. The logic is airtight. The math is the problem. Because here is what nobody calculates when they upgrade their life: the opportunity cost, not in the abstract, in the specific. That $200 jump in monthly rent over 20 years, invested modestly, It's not $200. It's closer to $90,000. That's not a lecture about lattes. That's a number you should sit with for a moment, because it's not about any single expense. It's about the pattern underneath every expense. Every small normalization of spending is a quiet vote against a future version of yourself who might have wanted options. And options, it turns out, are the only thing money can consistently buy that delivers what money keeps promising. This is where the story gets strange, because the person you'd expect to understand this didn't. And the person you'd expect to miss it saw it clearly from the beginning. Daniel understood something early that Marcus only discovered later. The gap between those two timelines is the entire ballgame. He understood that income is not wealth. It never was. Income is a flow. Wealth is a stock. And the distance between them, the gap between what comes in and what you keep, is the only number that actually determines your freedom. Think of it this way. A river can run fast and wide, but if there's no reservoir at the end of it, one dry season empties everything. Marcus had a fast river. Daniel was building the reservoir. Marcus had a high flow and nearly no stock. His money moved through his life like water through open hands, beautiful while it lasted, gone the moment it stopped. Daniel had a modest flow and a growing stock, month by month, year by year. He was building something that didn't require his presence to exist, something that would eventually be larger than any single paycheck and more durable than any single employer. The world tells you to increase your income. That's real advice, as far as it goes, but the world is much quieter about the other half of the equation. That income without a widening gap is just a more expensive treadmill. You run faster, the belt speeds up, the scenery never changes, and after enough years on it, you stop asking whether there was somewhere you were supposed to be going. Let me tell you about a second cost, one that doesn't show up on any spreadsheet. When your lifestyle inflates fast enough, something else happens, something subtler than a number. Your risk tolerance collapses. Marcus, at 38, got an opportunity, a chance to take a role at a smaller company, more equity, more creative control. Exactly the kind of work Hed told himself he'd pursue someday when the timing was right. He turned it down. Not because it was a bad opportunity, because he couldn't afford the pay cut. His apartment required a certain income. His car required a certain income. His life, as it had been constructed, had a minimum payment. And that minimum payment had grown too high to allow him to take a risk that might have changed everything. That's the hidden tax of lifestyle inflation that almost nobody discusses. It doesn't just take your money, it takes your options. It takes the moves you could have made. It takes the version of yourself that was free enough to try something before you were certain it would work. There's a reason the most interesting careers tend to belong to people who spent their 30s living well below their means. It's not coincidence. It's not discipline for its own sake. It's that they could afford to take the bet that other people couldn't. The job at the startup, the year spent building something of their own, the pivot that looked unreasonable from the outside, the gap made them brave. Or rather, the gap removed the constraint that makes bravery necessary, because the risk simply wasn't as catastrophic for them. Most of the best decisions in anyone's financial life were made by people who could afford to be wrong. Not because they were reckless, but because they'd preserved enough of a gap that a mistake wouldn't end them. Marcus couldn't afford to be wrong anymore, and so he stopped making moves. He started optimizing the position he was already in, which is a reasonable response, and a very different thing from building towards something new. Freedom is not a feeling, it's a number. And that number is the gap between what your life costs and what you could earn doing almost anything. Daniel kept that gap wide on purpose, deliberately, sometimes uncomfortably. He called it his freedom number, the monthly surplus that meant no single employer, no single circumstance, had total power over his choices. Some months, keeping it felt like discipline. Other months, it simply felt like the only sane thing he was doing while the people around him convinced themselves that another upgrade was just what they'd earned. Now here is the reframe I want to offer carefully, because it's easy to misread. This is not an argument for deprivation. It is not a case for small living or performative frugality. The goal is not to spend less. The goal is to spend intentionally and to understand with clarity what you're actually buying. When Marcus upgraded his apartment, he bought status and comfort. Those are real things. Comfort matters. Beauty matters. The feeling of coming home to a space that reflects who you believe yourself to be, that matters more than finance writers usually admit. And I won't pretend otherwise. But he also bought something he didn't mean to buy. He bought an obligation. He bought a fixed cost that would follow him for years. He bought a floor he now had to stand on. Even when standing on it felt like standing still. When Daniel kept his life lean, he wasn't sacrificing pleasure, he was buying time. He was buying the ability to say no to things that didn't serve him. He was buying the version of freedom that doesn't appear in any catalog, the kind where Tuesday afternoon is yours if you decide it should be. And he was buying something harder to name. The feeling of moving through your own life on terms that you set. What you spend your money on is what you believe in, not what you say you believe in. What you actually believe in, demonstrated by where the money goes each month after month, year after year. That's not judgment. That's just the most honest accounting I know. Now, here is the moment in this story that surprised me most, because it changes the analysis in a way I didn't expect. By 42, Daniel had options that Marcus could not afford to consider. His investment accounts had grown to the point where his money was generating meaningful returns without him. Not retire to a beach returns, but quit a job I hate and take 6 months to think returns, which is, in my experience, a form of wealth most people would choose over the beach. Because what people actually want isn't leisure, it's an agency. The ability to direct your own time is almost always the thing sitting at the center of what people say they're working toward. If you ask them carefully enough, Marcus was promoted again around the same time. His salary climbed. His apartment got a quiet upgrade. Nothing dramatic, just better finishes, a better address. The kind of move that's easy to justify and harder to undo. His life, from the outside, looked exactly like winning. And from the inside, if you could have asked him honestly in a quiet moment, he would have told you something was wrong with the math. He felt the same low-grade tightness Head felt for years. Head always assumed Head eventually outrun it, that there was a salary level where the anxiety would stop, where the numbers would feel like enough. There wasn't. Because the anxiety was never about the income, it was about the gap. And the gap stayed closed no matter how high the ceiling went, because the floor rose every time the ceiling did. But here is the part I didn't see coming. At 42, Marcus understood all of this. He had read enough, thought enough, to name the pattern clearly. He could have explained hedonic adaptation, opportunity cost, the difference between flow and stock. The knowledge wasn't missing. What was missing was the ability to act on it, because by then his identity had wrapped itself around his lifestyle. The apartment wasn't just an apartment, it was proof. Proof that the years of work had landed somewhere, that Head arrived at something worth arriving at. Downsizing didn't feel like a financial adjustment, it felt like a verdict on his own effort. And that is a different kind of problem than math alone can solve. That's the deeper trap inside lifestyle inflation. It doesn't only constrain your finances, it constrains your self-concept. And once your self-concept is anchored to what you spend, the gap isn't only hard to rebuild financially, it's psychologically threatening to attempt. Daniel had avoided this almost accidentally. Head never let his sense of self get tangled up in his possessions. His identity was built around something the market couldn't price. His freedom, his choices, his time. Those couldn't be taken from him by a bad quarter or a shift in the economy. They were his in a way that a lease or a car payment or a title on a door never quite is. The philosopher Seneca wrote, almost 2,000 years ago, that it is not the man who has too little who is poor, but the man who craves more. He was not talking about minimalism. He was describing a specific kind of poverty. The psychological poverty of never arriving, of raising the bar every time you get close, of building a life that costs more than it gives back in the things that cannot be photographed. Marcus arrived at 50 with a high salary, a beautiful apartment, and a retirement date he kept pushing further out. Not because he was irresponsible, because he had optimized, quite effectively, for the appearance of a good life, and slightly missed the life itself. Daniel arrived at 50 with less on paper and considerably more in practice. He retired at 53, not to do nothing, to do only what he chose to, which turned out to be quite a lot. Some of it looked like work. From the outside, the difference was that none of it was required. The principle at the center of all of this is not complicated, but it resists easy action because it runs against something embedded deep, the instinct to signal progress through visible things, to let our surroundings confirm that the effort was worth something, to earn the right, in some legible way, to say, I got here. Your lifestyle should grow more slowly than your income, always. Not because spending is bad, because the gap is what gives you leverage over your own life. And leverage over your own life is the only financial outcome that reliably delivers what money keeps promising. The high salary without the gap is a beautiful trap. The growing portfolio without the intentionality that built it is just anxiety with better numbers. The early retirement without the gap that made it possible remains a goal that keeps moving. The number is not the point. The number never was. What the number was supposed to make possible, that is the point. Freedom from a job you no longer believe in. Time with people you love while there is still time. The ability to take a risk that might be the most important move you ever make. The permission to rest without calculation. None of those things show up in a salary negotiation, but all of them are available. They just require choosing the gap over the upgrade. Consistently, quietly, across years that will pass either way. Marcus and Daniel still have coffee sometimes. On the corner of 5th and Main. Not far from where they started. Same cart, same order. Same easy way of being around each other that old colleagues carry when they've seen enough of each other's lives to skip the performance. Marcus is thinking about downsizing now, not because he wants to, because the math is finally asking him to, clearly enough that he can't look past it anymore. As running calculations he didn't think to run at 34, and they are arriving late with compound interest on the delay. Daniel listened to him last week, over that coffee, and didn't say anything for a while. Then he said, "It's not too late. The gap still works. It just means deciding what you actually want the money to do." Right? It is a decision. It was always a decision, dressed up, most of the time, as something inevitable. The goal was never the number. The goal was always what the number was supposed to make possible. If something in this shifted the way you see your own decisions, stay with me. Because next, we're going to look at something that surprised even me. The hidden upgrade cycle that quietly rewires what high earners believe they deserve. The one that doesn't just drain your savings, but makes the drain feel completely justified. Not obvious, invisible. And the reason it works is not what you think.